So the magnum opus of humanity would be an everybody wins scenario. And this is the ultimate goal that we should never forget. Everything for everybody. We often start in philosophy with Jonathan Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, or the idea that it's the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Or, utilitarianism is basically the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. A lot of people thought it was difficult to calculate happiness. Relativism creeps in and it's kind of, well, everybody's happy in different ways. And then it sort of like tears the notion apart. If you stick to a metric that's more like scientific, like productive and destructive, the greatest amount of human flourishing for the greatest number of people, the greatest amount of aversion to suffering for the greatest number of people. That's really like a triage situation, because in the end, you want everything for everybody, okay? That should always be the goal, everything for everybody. Food, air, water, shelter, healthcare, education for everybody at some base level. And that goes for everybody in the entire world. Nationality is a fabricated division, okay? It shouldn't even, in my opinion, exist. We're all part of this same world. We're interconnected. Resources are limited. There's an ethical implication for those who take more than they need. There just is. There's no qualification or justification for it. If you take more than you need to survive, there's an ethical implication that directly correlates with the amount of limited resources that we have. Now, granted, if you count debt, there's like so much value in the world. If you count debt, there's like 450 trillion in asset, but then there's so many quadrillion of debt. So it's a complicated situation, but in the end, resources are limited. That's why people are starving around the world. People don't have clean water. People live in houses with dirt floors and that kind of thing, right? The greatest amount of good for the greatest number applies to the whole world. No qualification, okay? And people understand utilitarianism. It has to have the minority protection, because if you're going for a majority group, there's always going to be people that don't fit into the majority somehow. So you have to have conscious minority protection, and that's one of the caveats of being for a notion like utilitarianism. But like I said, the ideal situation is everything for everybody. What's interesting is that animals literally eat each other for food. That's the raw substance of nature, killing. It's not always necessary, but that's just what, nature does in itself. That doesn't justify that humans can do that. We can be better than that, so we are culpable for doing things like that when not necessary. I'm going to talk a little about universal prescriptivism, and just to remind you guys to watch my video on universal humanism, which is a similar concept. Let's talk a little about R.M. Hare's very clear, fixed idea, because it's important, and in my mind, it's the perfect description of the actual when it comes to the is and the ought. The most prominent form is universal prescriptivism, developed by R.M. Hare. Universal prescriptivism is a metaethical theory which argues that moral statements are not factual claims, but rather universalizable prescriptions, imperatives about how people ought to behave. Universalizability. If you affirm a moral judgment or principle, you must be willing to apply it in all similar situations, no matter who is involved. If you shouldn't steal, then nobody in a similar position should. It's not just I don't like lying, it's no one should lie, including me, in relevant similar situations. Why it works. It demands consistency in moral reasoning. It avoids the idea that ethics is just a pure personal preference like emotivism or relativism. It keeps the logical structure of moral language but rejects that moral claims are statements of fact. Critics say it struggles to resolve moral disagreements. If we all agree to universalize but our prescriptions differ, who's right? So I really hate this type of relativistic thinking. Who is right is the one who maximizes life and flourishing of life. There's a lot of questions. People who like to decide who lives and who dies at their convenience will always appeal to the long-term goals or nebulous reasoning to marginalize the other as they see it. It's a bit of a paradoxical balance, because the more we spread the wealth out to the majority, the less each individual gets. But the other option is that some special individual decides who gets more and who gets less, especially when talking about necessity. That's the core of destructive power distribution. When it comes to necessity, nobody has the right to choose you for death. Nobody has the right to qualify you. It's a conundrum because life itself has deterministic scenarios where there's nothing but bad outcomes, and we get unsavory trolley car-like scenarios that we have to manage. We should always try to create an everybody wins scenario, but if we absolutely can't escape bad situations, sometimes loaded choices have to be made. That's not to say that those who lean in with their group first and say, well, I make that decision by doing what's right for my subgroup, they're not justified. That's not to say that they're justified just because we're in a loaded situation with limited resources. You do this and I do that, and it's all relative. No, there's still justice to account for. We should always strive to be objective and act universally, similar to what Hare presents here, universal prescriptivism. Others say it dodges realism, leaving morality without any objective truth, just a set of rational principles. So as far as objective truth goes, I don't think it dodges it at all. It actually does a good job of separating effectively the is from the ought, the description from the prescription. Prescriptions are never free from the reality they attempt to prescribe for. Just language alone is attached to reality. Objective truth is descriptive. That objective truth may contain the subjective actions of agents contained within it. We can have objective truths about subjective outcomes, but we can't forget that preserving life, avoiding suffering, and promoting human flourishing at large has to be the central principle and foundation of ethics. Then we can review objective truths like scientists and engineers and attempt to create systematic processes that generate flourishing outcomes for all. It's very difficult to do when we allow people to say, your preservation of life, aversion to suffering, and promotion of human flourishing for all goes against my preservation of my subgroup, aversion to suffering for my subgroup, and my belief that everybody in my subgroup deserves to flourish and you or everybody outside of my subgroup does not. These are not just two different points of view, and everybody has their own point of view. That's complete nonsense. It's relativistic nonsense, and it relativizes that which needs to be punished. It pulls a blindfold over the duty necessary to maintain justice, universality, fairness, and people's right to survive, regardless of what they've done. You didn't get to decide that you about your existence. Therefore, there's some implication that existence should take care of you. In fact, a state can't even be known as a state unless it takes care of the least fortunate. I mean, the Romans knew as soon as the corn dole ran out that there would be chaos in the streets. This is just understood about how life is if you don't put a floor under it. No one can ever create a higher and more important idea than Hare's prescriptivism, his universal prescriptivism here. This is an emergent idea that's bigger than any of us, bigger than any group. It's bigger than humans, really, because it emerges from the deterministic nature of life. Universality is in our deterministic physical reality. Our genes carry the history of our evolution. Watching a baby develop is like watching a time warp of coagulated history. It's like you zoom in from another dimension and just launch out into three-dimensional space, hungry for sensory input. Then we nurture our children for survival. Sometime in our 20s, we sort of drop out of hyperspace and start building our own little subjective homes. Every one of us deserves the unqualified right to base necessities: food, air, water, shelter, healthcare, education. Any system that attempts to consciously stop this is a corrupt system. I'm talking about worldwide, nobody left behind. You don't get to say, I worked hard, so you can die and I can live. It doesn't matter how hard you work. You never earn the right to even believe or say something like that, ever. Sometimes, deterministically, resources become limited because reality itself is structured in such a way that we're forced into conflict. But it's always a triage last resort. Anybody that thinks that they get to choose that is going to be in for an awakening when things sort of, what do they call it on The Expanse? The churn. When the churn happens, you're going to be very surprised. If you guys like this kind of philosophical subject matter, help us out by liking the video and subscribe to the channel.